Welcome. By now, you've spent the last 4 lessons building frameworks for designing transdisciplinary research. You understand ecosystems of knowledge, synthesis methodologies, complexity theory, and integrative analysis. But here's the truth we need to face. Designing research on paper is fundamentally different from implementing it with real people, communities, and institutions that have their own priorities, constraints, and expertise. This lesson is about that gap, what I call the implementation challenge. It's the messy, relational work of turning elegant designs into actual partnerships that create change. And it starts with recognizing that stakeholders aren't passive recipients of your research. They're active shapers of what knowledge gets produced and how it gets used. The power dynamics in your research, who gets to ask questions, whose knowledge counts as valid, who benefits from findings. These are determined not just by your research design, but by how you intentionally manage relationships throughout implementation. This lesson focuses on 3 core practices. First, how to identify and understand stakeholders beyond surface-level lists. Second, how to structure authentic co-production that shifts power rather than just adding voices. And third, how to navigate the inevitable tensions that emerge when different worldviews, timelines, and priorities collide. Let's start with the most foundational step, understanding who your stakeholders actually are. Stakeholder mapping is often treated like a checkbox exercise. You make a list, you say you've engaged stakeholders, and you move on. But that approach misses the real diagnostic power of stakeholder analysis. What you're actually doing is understanding the ecosystem in which your research will operate. Think of it as a systems map. You're trying to answer, who does this research touch? Who influences what gets researched? Who controls resources? Whose knowledge is typically undervalued? Let me give you a concrete example. Say you're designing a transdisciplinary research project on community health in an urban neighborhood. The obvious stakeholders are the people living in the neighborhood, right? But now layer in the clinicians at the local health center, community health workers who have deep relational knowledge, patients with lived experience of health problems, the local health department with authority to implement policy, and the foundations funding the work. But go deeper. Who influences whether clinicians actually adopt your recommendations? Their administrators, their electronic health record systems, the insurance companies determining reimbursement. Who influences whether the community engages? Trust relationships, past experiences with research extraction, competing demands on their time. This is where power mapping becomes critical. You're not just listing actors. You're asking, who has decision-making authority? Who controls funding? Who has knowledge legitimacy? Who has been historically marginalized? If you identify these distinctions up front, you can intentionally design engagement that brings marginalized knowledge holders into positions of influence. Without that analysis, even well-intentioned research reproduces existing hierarchies. So, effective stakeholder mapping requires you to move beyond obvious participants to understand the full relational landscape. Here's a terminology problem in research. We use the word engagement to mean everything from asking someone to complete a survey to building collaborative partnerships. That ambiguity costs us. It lets us claim engagement without actually sharing power. So let me be precise about what different engagement models actually entail. Consultation is when you say, we've decided to do research, and we'll tell you about our decisions. It's informational. It's often tokenistic because researchers retain authority. You might ask for feedback, but you've already set the frame. Collaboration moves the needle. It means you're making decisions together. That's genuinely better. But it often stays academia-centered because researchers still have structural advantages. They control timelines, funding, publications. Co-production is different. It means stakeholders help identify what questions matter in the first place. They help design methods. They help interpret what findings mean. They help decide how to disseminate and use results. That's shared power over the entire research process. Now, here's the hard part. Co-production looks democratic in theory, but it requires confronting epistemic injustice. The problem that we've systematically dismissed knowledge from non-academic sources as insufficiently rigorous. This is a credibility bias, not a rigor problem. A community health worker has deep knowledge about what affects their neighborhood. A patient has expertise about living with chronic illness. When you structure co-production intentionally, you're actively countering that historical bias. You're saying your knowledge is legitimate, and this research won't proceed without your leadership. That's not just more inclusive, it's epistemologically more honest. So what does co-production look like structurally? How do you actually organize it? Here are the evidence-based models that work. First, participatory advisory boards. But these have to have real authority, not just advisory, which means they comment on decisions others made. Actual decision-making power, voting on how research funds get allocated, influence over research questions, authority to say that method won't work in our context. Second, embedded researchers. This means hiring someone from the stakeholder community and funding them as researchers, not as cheap labor. They have full-time positions. They understand both community context and research methodology. This is different from hiring community members to do data collection and calling that co-production. Third, iterative feedback loops at project milestones, not just an annual review. Monthly or quarterly check-ins where stakeholders can flag problems early, suggest course corrections, surface tensions before they become crises. Fourth, shared data governance agreements. This is often overlooked, but crucial. Who owns the data? Who can publish findings? What does the community get from participation? These need to be explicit, documented agreements, not handshake deals. Finally, joint interpretation workshops. Not researchers analyzing data alone and then presenting findings to stakeholders. Researchers and stakeholders together making sense of what the data means. This is resourced time where diverse ways of knowing come together to create meaning. These structures require more upfront investment, but they prevent the failure mode where researchers extract data and disappear, leaving communities without voice or benefit. Even with strong structures, implementation surfaces tensions. These aren't failures of your design, they're features of working across institutional and epistemological boundaries. Let me name the most common ones so you can recognize them when they appear. Temporal mismatch is real. Universities operate on semester cycles or academic years. Communities operate on program cycles, funding cycles, political cycles. A community partner might say, we need to shift research focus because a new health crisis emerged in our neighborhood. An academic partner might say, that's scope creep. We can't change direction mid-project. Who's right? Both are, in their respective systems. The power question is, whose timeline gets prioritized? If the academic timeline always wins, you're centering academic institutional needs over community responsiveness. Epistemological tension is subtle but pervasive. A researcher trained in quantitative work prioritizes statistical power and generalizability. A community partner prioritizes understanding mechanisms that actually affect their members' lives. Those aren't competing truths, they're complementary. But if you don't name the difference, you have unresolved conflict disguised as technical disagreement. Resource asymmetry. If the research requires community members' time but doesn't budget for compensation, you're extracting value. If you budget compensation for data collection, but only academics get paid for thinking and planning, you're replicating hierarchies. The visibility issue is crucial for equity. If only academic researchers get publications and conference presentations, the research reproduces traditional power. Who becomes the researcher is a power question. And when stakeholder interests genuinely diverge, funders want outcomes by year one. Community partners identify long-term systems change as priority. These need to surface as explicit choices, not hidden by polite language. Adaptive management is borrowed from environmental science and is essential for transdisciplinary work. The core idea is simple. You can't plan perfectly up front, so build in regular opportunities to learn and adjust. Start with feedback loops. Regular check-ins, monthly or quarterly. Not just annual reviews, but they have to be genuine. If you solicit feedback but don't act on it, you damage trust. If you create pressure to maintain harmony rather than surface problems, you'll miss early warning signs. Psychological safety is the foundation. It genuinely has to be okay to say, "This isn't working," without consequences. Create explicit decision protocols. When stakeholders disagree about methods, timeline, what findings mean, how do you decide? Consensus can feel democratic, but can also lead to slow decisions or compromises that satisfy no one. Some collaborations use consensus with documented override. Aim for consensus, but if you can't reach it after X time, the community partner decides, or the principal investigator decides, depending on the decision domain. The point is being explicit, so decisions don't happen by default. Document adaptations. What changed? Why? What did you learn? This creates institutional memory. If your research team turns over, and it will, new people can understand partnership history and why current practices exist. Reflection cycles are built-in pause points. Quarterly, step back and ask, are we moving toward what we said we wanted? Are relationships strengthening or straining? Is the research still responsive to community needs? Is the timeline realistic? This isn't administrative overhead. It's how you stay adaptive, rather than rigidly executing a plan that no longer fits. Here's where many transdisciplinary projects fail evaluation. They use traditional academic metrics as the success measure, number of publications, citation counts. But transdisciplinary research explicitly aims at systems change, practice change, community capacity. Those outcomes don't look like publication counts. Academic output remains important, but it's insufficient. Ask instead, has research influenced practice? Has a clinic adopted new screening protocols? Has a policy changed? Knowledge translation is the pathway. How does research actually influence action? Relational goods matter. Have relationships strengthened? Has trust increased among stakeholders who previously didn't work together? Has capacity grown? These are real outcomes. They're harder to quantify, but they're central to transdisciplinary work. Epistemic outcomes are subtle. Are marginalized knowledge holders now recognized as credible? Are community members invited to research planning conversations? Is their knowledge cited as expertise, not data? Systems and structural change is the hardest to attribute. Did your research cause the policy shift, or was it one factor among many? But you can still document influence and track mechanisms. Community-defined success is crucial. Ask stakeholders directly. What did you hope would be different because of this research? Did those things happen? This might differ from your original hypothesis. It is valuable information. When you evaluate transdisciplinary work only by traditional metrics, you're invisible to your own success. A theory of change forces you to be explicit about what you think will happen and why. In transdisciplinary research, you often have multiple theories of change operating simultaneously. Start by naming the problem. What system or issue prompted this research? What's your root cause theory? Then, map pathways. How will integrated knowledge lead to change? Maybe direct user adoption. Practitioners immediately use findings. Maybe policy influence. Advocacy groups use findings in legislation advocacy. Maybe community empowerment. Community members gain capacity to advocate for themselves. These aren't competing pathways, they're complementary. They operate on different timelines and require different strategies. Identify leverage points. Where in the system is research most likely to create change? If you're doing research on clinical screening, a leverage point might be the electronic health record. If you get new questions into the EHR, they'll be asked for every patient. If you're doing community organizing research, a leverage point might be election cycles. If your research influences voter priorities, change happens at scale. Specify assumptions. What must be true for your pathways to work? For clinicians to adopt findings, they must see clinical relevance and have time and resources to implement. If you have one but not the other, adoption doesn't happen. Making assumptions visible upfront means you can work on them intentionally or recognize when they're not met and adjust expectations. Plan for multiple outcomes. You might have individual level outcomes. Community members gain skills. Organizational outcomes. Health systems adopt new practices. Policy outcomes, legislation shifts. These happen on different timelines and require different evaluation strategies. Participatory evaluation is fundamentally different from traditional external evaluation. You and your stakeholders are continuously learning about what's working, not waiting for an outside evaluator to judge at the end. This serves multiple functions. It provides accountability, it informs real-time adaptation, and it builds stakeholder capacity for evaluation thinking. Real-time learning is crucial. Quick feedback loops, monthly or quarterly, allow you to adjust while there's still time. If a strategy isn't working, you learn it in month 4, not month 36. This requires mixed methods. Not all important changes are quantifiable. A policy change might be yes or no, quantitative, but understanding why it happened requires qualitative inquiry. Did research findings trigger it? Did relationship building with policymakers create openness? Did a political opportunity window make the time right? All might be true simultaneously. Use evaluative inquiry. Ask questions with stakeholders, not about them. You're building shared understanding together. A simple practice. Every quarter, meet with stakeholders and ask, what worked, what didn't, what surprised us, what changed, what do we need to adjust? Document emergence. Stay alert to changes you didn't predict. Sometimes the most valuable outcomes are unexpected. A practitioner discovers a new way of thinking about a problem. A community member gains confidence to advocate. A policymaker shifts their framing. These are real outcomes worth capturing even if they weren't in your original plan. When you only look for predicted outcomes, you're blind to the full value of your work. This is where many transdisciplinary projects fail. The funded project ends, relationships dissolve, findings sit in reports. Sustainability requires intentional planning. First, distinguish outputs from outcomes. Outputs are discrete: the research report, the dataset, the publications. They're done when the project ends. Outcomes are processes: practice changes, policy shifts, community empowerment. These continue beyond the project. If you want outcomes to persist, you need to plan for what happens after funding ends. Institutionalization is the highest bar. The research approach or partnership becomes standard practice, not a special initiative. Maybe it means funding permanent positions, embedding the practice in standard operating procedures, creating ongoing advisory structures. This requires much more than one grant. Relationship maintenance is under-budgeted. Relationships are assets. Assets require maintenance. If you don't budget for it, even just for quarterly communication, even just for one staff person whose job is relationship stewardship, relationships attenuate. Some research teams build explicit, sustaining relationships phases between grants. Recognition timelines matters. You can't expect systems-level policy change if the policy cycle is 5 to 7 years and your project is 3 years. You can document that you've influenced the conversation and positioned stakeholders to advocate, but the ultimate policy outcome takes longer. Celebrate and document. Transdisciplinary work is challenging. It deserves recognition. Creating narrative about what was accomplished beyond metrics helps stakeholders see value and builds motivation for the next phase. And finally, plan your own transition. Who maintains relationships when you leave? Who continues the work? Who remembers why certain practices exist? If you don't answer these questions, your successor inherits a partnership without context. The research you've built together is fragile without intentional transition planning. That's not a failure. It's the reality of creating change across systems. Thank you.